Ready. So I think we'll get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Philip Bloom. I'm the June and Simon Casey Lee Curator of the Chinese Garden at the Huntington. And it's my pleasure to welcome everyone to this evening's talk by Professor Sonya Lee of the University of Southern California. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight for the final lecture in our Spring 2020 series. I'd like to express my particular thanks to the Justin Vanya Memorial Fund for supporting this and many of our other programs in the Chinese Garden. So tonight's speaker is Dr. Sonya Lee, Associate Professor of Chinese Art and Visual Cultures at the University of Southern California. She holds joint appointments in the departments of Art History, East Asian Languages and Cultures, and Religion. And she's currently the director of the East Asian Studies Center at USC. She's a specialist in religious art and architecture of China and Central Asia, and she's published widely on the material culture of Chinese Buddhism. She received her PhD from the University of Chicago and is the author of two important books, Surviving Nirvana, Death of the Buddha in Chinese Visual Culture, published by Hong Kong University Press in 2010, and Temples in the Cliffside, Buddhist Art in Sichuan, published by the University of Washington Press, I think just a few weeks ago. I just received my copy a couple of days ago. And it's this book that will be the focus of her talk this evening. So at first glance, the title, Temples in the Cliffside, Buddhist Art in Sichuan, might seem a little bit out of place in a lecture series ostensibly centered on East Asian garden culture. But the primary conceptual focus of Professor Lee's book really is something that has a lot to do with gardens, namely the relationship among art making, ecology, and landscape management. In her book's 5 chapters, Professor Lee investigates everything from the ways that a landscape's specific geologic and botanical features shaped the Buddhist images that were created there, to the means by which those hubs of devotional activity were transformed into tourist attractions in the 20th and 21st centuries. Most importantly, she demonstrates that careful study of historical practices of using and maintaining Buddhist sites could actually provide inspiration for the ongoing management of those sites in the present. In so doing, I think Professor Lee has crafted a profoundly eye-opening book that makes the study of art history relevant to contemporary questions about sustainability. It's a book that resonates with me personally. Many of the issues that Professor Lee points to are considerations that my colleagues and I must address in our management of the Huntington's Gardens. And I very much hope that you'll all read Professor Lee's book, which can be purchased from the Huntington store at a link that we will circulate in the chat. At any time during Professor Lee's talk this evening, please enter your questions into the Q&A box, which should appear at the top or bottom of your screen, depending on your device. I will pose your questions to Professor Lee at the end of her talk. The talk will probably last around 45 minutes or so, and like all of our lectures, it will be recorded and made available as a video on the Huntington's website and on YouTube. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Sonya Lee.
Great, well, thank you. I'd like to start by thanking Philip for inviting me to this lecture series, and also to Michelle for organizing the event and handling all the logistics. I'm really excited to have this opportunity to share with you some of the key findings from my new book, Cave Temple, Temples in the Cliffside, Buddhist Art in Sichuan, just published quite recently, originally published at the end of 2021, but there has been some delay in the shipment of copies, so it's just been available. So, so let me share my screen and start the talk. I hope you'll be able to see my PowerPoint. Okay, so this is the book. In this book, one major argument I make is that cave temples are part of the world's sustainable future. It's precisely because these sites have been around for so long that they offer us many lessons in sustainability. I would like to focus very much on this argument today, because many of you are part of the Huntington family, and recently sustainability has become one of the top priorities for the Huntington. So for those of you who are familiar with the current discourse of sustainability, you might notice that cultural monuments like cave temples are rarely part of the conversation. That's another reason why it's really important for us to think about these cultural monuments as part of our response to the many challenges we face today, especially when it comes to climate change and sustainability. So let me start with just a very basic definition of sustainability so that we are on the same page. So there are many definitions out there, and this concept has been in discussion, especially in policy circle or in planning discourses since the 80s. And it's more or less about a certain configuration of social and economic practices that need to be compatible with the long-term sustainability, stability of the environment. And a classic definition came from the so-called Bluntland Report from 1987, in which sustainable development is defined as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So, so as you can see, in these pretty recent discussion about sustainability, it's pretty much about what we do now and how it might impact the future. So it's a present to future dynamic. And so what I'm advocating through this book is that we need to include the past as part of the conversation by considering the importance of cultural monuments. And so that's something that I would very much like to push forward. Now, cave temples are quite unique in that regard because they've been around for a very long time. And so let me just introduce this very unique type of architecture to many of you in the audience. So as you can see in my map in the lower part of the screen, it can be found in pretty much throughout Eurasia or pretty much throughout Asia. And it's indicated by the different circles. So some of the earliest ones can be found in central India, like what you see on the screen near the top. So these are classic examples of cave temples. And for example, those at Baja can be dated to more than 2,000 years ago, and still here with us today. And so you're talking about 2,000-year-long history already. Now, if you follow the other circle, I will take you to Central Asia or the eastern part of Central Asia. Then we have some of the better known sites, such as Mogao Caves of Dunhuang on your left, and then Kizo Caves in Kucha. And so I show you the overview of the sites and also what's inside some of the units that you see at those sites. And for today, I would very much like to introduce you some of the sites in southwestern part of China, which correspond to today's Sichuan province and Chongqing self-administered region. And so we have some pretty well-known sites like the Great Leshan Buddha in Leshan City, and then Baodingshan in Daju district, and then the sites in the upper left-hand corner, Nankan Caves, will be something I will talk a lot about today. So as you can see, in some of these examples I have shown on the screen, cave temples are hybrid spaces that are at once natural and artificial. So they were created when pictorial images were carved along a cliff face. And also really important to keep in mind that when these images are created, there's always some form of shelter provided around them to preserve the work from the ravages of time and the elements. So as you can see, they are outstanding examples of art embedded in nature, embodying the interaction of art and the environment in the longue durée. Cave temples, I would like to characterize them as the product of a will to create and a commitment to preserve. So the two are inseparable. So when you create something in nature, you really need to do more in order to make them be preserved and last longer. And so the will to create and the commitment to preserve go hand in hand. So let me introduce you some of other important characteristics of cave temples. So I already underscored the remarkable longevity of these sites. So lasting hundreds or over 1,000 years. So I think in some of the cases in India, almost 2,000 years or over 2,000 years. The sites in Sichuan may be a slightly shorter in time span, but still you're talking about a couple hundred years to over 1,000. So, and so what's really interesting is that they don't stay the same over time. So a lot of these started out as religious centers, and over time they still remain religious centers, but taken care of by other generations of devotees. Sometimes they're abandoned and then revived by a completely different group. And so all kinds of things could happen to them. So we modified, restored, repainted. Some of them have been destroyed. So, so these are the things that happen quite often in pre-modern times. And then when we fast forward to modernity, they also underwent very drastic changes, such as being turned into cultural heritage properties and also tourist destinations for mass tourism. So, so these are the things that happen, and I try to account for them in my book. Now, another important aspect of cave temples I would like to highlight here is that they have this perceived religious power that's closely tied to the natural setting. So the mountain setting underscores a liminal space that they occupy. It signals a kind of intermediary zone between civilization and wilderness, which allows humans to establish a foothold at the borders of what we call uninhabitable. So, so people don't normally live at cave temples because they are at the edges of civilization. Because once you go beyond these edges, you enter into no man's land or wilderness. But that's precisely what makes them so interesting, because you can do all kinds of crazy things there too, such as carry out rituals and to enhance the power of these places. And so, so these places are very special throughout human history, both in the past and also in the present. And so even today, because a lot of them continue to occupy very important places in today's society. So when you visit these cave temples, like some of the people you see on the screen in these photographs, you still feel the magic of these places, that they take you somewhere else. They make you forget the here and the now. And so that's why they can be called places of dialogical transcendence. I'm borrowing this concept from President Dura's very important argument about Asia's contribution to the world's sustainable future, because it's really important to bring religion into the discussion about some of these challenges we face with climate change, sustainability, and all those. And so I follow his lead by including these cultural monuments as part of our discussion. So, so in my book, I try to capture the dynamic, ever-changing nature of these cave temples. And because they are ever-changing, ever-evolving, so I try to capture them by dividing my book into two parts, each addressing a fundamental question. So one question I ask is, how did the natural site shape the design of a cave temple? So in what way nature contributes to its design? And so I use two case studies to answer those. I focus particularly on the Leshan Buddha that you see on the lower right-hand corner, and the Baodingshan site that you see in the lower right-hand corner. And the second question I ask myself is, once the site is established, how does it change the way people interact with nature and also the way to think about it. And so this question, it's really about sustainability. So what the compels people to do to really keep it alive and preserve it. So that's what I would like to talk more about today. So there are many lessons in sustainability that we can learn from these cave temple sites. And I frame those lessons in relation to two key relationships that are central to the Anthropocene discourse. So one has to do with how society interacts and relate to nature, and how people in society make use of natural resources or how to shape the landscape. So that's a very important question. Now, the second question is more about how we humans relate to other non-human entities. And so these two are huge questions related to the current geological age that we live in, that's being called Anthropocene. And so just in case you don't know what this concept means, so let me show you this set of visuals. So on the right, you have a time chart showing you the different geological epochs. Until maybe 20, 30 years ago, everybody agreed that we are in the middle of the Holocene epoch. So near where my arrow is. So this epoch pretty much marks the warming of the planet emerging out of the latest ice age. So Pleistocene, that's what we're talking about. Now, this is actually very important because, as you can tell from the time, that's when humans, Homo erectus, emerge. Like that's why I put this image here. Now, Anthropocene came about, the term was coined, to say popularized by a climate scientist, Paul Crutzen, and his colleagues around the year 2000, and basically argue that because of human activities, from all kinds of activities related to industrialization, urbanization, population growth, all these activities led to very profound changes to the Earth atmosphere, surface, ocean on a scale not seen before. So especially the release of greenhouse gases, the increase of natural disasters, loss of diversity, biodiversity, increase in social inequalities, drive toward artificial intelligence, synthetic life forms, all these developments resulted from human activities. So one very basic finding or consequence of all this is the realization that humans are now a geophysical force capable of changing the climate of the planet. So this is a very profound realization, has all kinds of implications across different fields of knowledge. And so in some way, my book is grappling with this. And so that's why the two key relationships that I mentioned earlier are so crucial to talk about. Now going back to this. So in terms of lessons of sustainability, so what are the methods that we could use to really dive into it? And since I'm in art history, I like to tell you or promote the material culture perspective. So this is not new. Actually, it's been around for quite some time. So when I say material culture perspective, I am talking about using things that human makes, objects, structures, as my primary source material to really try to understand the mindsets or the attitudes, the values inherent in the making. And so, so this is a really important method adopted not only by people in art history, but in fact in archaeology, in religion, anthropology, to really try to understand human culture without relying too much on textual sources. So you can sort of see the move from text to images in some way. And another really important implication is that a lot of people in the past did not leave behind any writings of their own. And in the case of China, it's especially startling because only, say, the top 5% of population knew how to read and write, and these people left behind sources. So as you can see, there are all kinds of, I guess nowadays you call them biases, associated with this kind of writings. So in order to get to the people, the people who did not leave behind records, but they actually participated in all kinds of material cultural productions. And so if you analyze them, you have different kind of access to them to be able to uncover their voices, their concerns. And so that's another really important advantage that material culture perspective offers. And I would also add that in the study of Buddhism, for example, it's also a really powerful way to go beyond some of the, I would say, misunderstanding or misconceptions about nature. So because in the environmental, the movements, environmentalism of the 70s and 80s, a lot of the proponents of these movements, such as people in the deep ecology movement, try to romanticize Buddhism, to project them as some sort of nature lovers, as rationalists, and they all look to Buddhists in the past for inspiration. And that's part of the strategy to try to change people's behavior and value in order to coexist with nature. And so really important concepts about from Buddhism, such as no self, non-duality, all these things were incorporated in the language of environmentalism of the past. But as time evolved, and we now have very different understanding of what Buddhists did in the past, especially the attitude toward nature. We know nowadays, thanks to more critical reassessment of Buddhist history, Buddhist practices in the past, we know that they are not nature lovers as once projected. And they cut trees. They exploited nature for gains, especially with temples, because they own all the land and they use the land for agricultural activities of all sorts in order to survive. And that's actually part of how sites survive, because people in charge of those sites, site managers, had to worry about all these things. And so the productivity of the land is actually a very important part of the consideration. By looking at material culture perspective, I think we actually can have all kinds of openings into these developments that have not been studied as much before. So that's another really important part of it. Now, I would like to move on and highlight another important part of my study. In order to really get at all these different perspectives about sustainability, we need to be open-minded and learn from the past. And so as it turned out, there are actually multiple histories of sustainability and diverse strategies to achieve stated goals. And so just with cave temples alone, we can actually do quite a lot already. And just imagine that if we go beyond this unique tradition of cave making and include other past cultural monuments, I think we can open up all kinds of possibilities. So going back to the caves, there are 3 groups, stakeholder groups that I focus on in this book: the managers, the visitors, and the restorers. So, and I have specific examples to talk about them. And each group had their own understanding of what they try to sustain through the actions and also through the sponsorship. And in turn, the way they carry out those ideas to make them turn them into practice are very different. So just imagine for managers. So they, as I just mentioned a bit earlier, they are very concerned about the productivity of the land. And so that's what they focus on. And in some way, what they did in the past, here kind of close to a lot of things that we label as part of the sustainability discourse today, the social and economic practices that can be called sustainable practices today. But then if you turn to the other two groups, they are not as well known because barely people look into the cultural sector to talk about sustainability. And so, so today, I would like to use some more concrete examples to give you an idea of what sustainability meant. So I will focus in particular on visitors. So the site that I would like to use as the example is Nankan Caves, which is located in northern part of Sichuan. So, so we're talking about Southwest China, and then here's a detailed map. And so Nankan Caves is located, sorry, in the northern part of the Sichuan province, and it's located along a one of the major tributaries of the Yangtze River. So the name of the province, Sichuan, literally means the four rivers. So the Yangtze River plus the three major tributaries. And so Chu River, it's one of them. And in this area, Baodingshan City is the largest. And so Nankan Caves is located quite close to the city center. And if you visit it today, it's part of this area called the Nankan Mountain Scenic Area. And if you look at this map, there are actually a lot of things included as part of this complex. So Nankan Caves indicated by the red or the dark orange part. And so, so there are actually a couple places where you will find relief carvings. And so that's part of it. And I will talk more about the other elements in purple later in talk. So here is an overview of the main cliff face, where you see hundreds of these niches being carved out of this cliff face. And some of them are pretty large. So for example, the Buddha that you see here, it's several meters tall, I think 15 feet about. So, and, and you can also guess that there was once a pretty large wooden frame platform that was built in front of it so that people could actually walk up. And if you look more carefully at the cliff face, you can sort of roughly guess where maybe where different levels once existed. So that's probably one level, and then there's another level here. And so what's really great about the shelter was that it actually protected these carvings for a very long time. And it disappeared only fairly recently, I would say maybe 100 some years ago. And there's been also talks at the site to rebuild it, both to make it easier for tourists to climb up and also for protective reasons. So, but it hasn't happened, and there's really no plan to do it right now. So, so that's sort of give you an idea of what the site looks like. Now, what's really great about this place is that there are a lot of donor inscriptions that have been preserved. So thanks in part to the shelter that protected these carvings and also the writings that came along with them. So we have a really good record of visitorship at the site. And I would say unprecedented in this whole southwestern region. So couldn't think of another site that had more inscription. So those are great. And from these inscriptions, the carvings that we have, and also the general distribution of other parts. So we have a fairly good picture of the history of this site. And so this chart shows you some of these important episodes. So you can see that the earliest activities took place in the early 7th century, and the site pretty much remained active all the way to the 20th century. So it's 1400 years of history. And of course, there were periods when it fell into disuse. So I indicated those, such as in the 10th century, and also in the 13th to the 17th century, because there's nothing that we have no records of. And we couldn't really find anything else, say in the local gazetteers. So something happened and we don't know what happened. But anyways, and then people came back and continued to do all kinds of activities. Now, if you pay attention to the two columns here, you see that the site has a very interesting history, a combination of both new images and about restoration. And so it's actually a really great example to study restoration, art restoration. So, so some of these new sites, new niches, I should say, quickly fill up the most ideal space for carving, and maybe spaces ran out. And instead of looking to another location to continue those activities, donors switch to restoration. And so starting in the 8th century, and it got quite intense at some point, donors focused primarily on restoring existing images. And they also talk about their reactions to seeing old images or images that are falling into disuse. And so, so those are really special material to deal with. And I would also show you some examples, some of the new images added in the early part of the 20th century, a bit later. Okay, so so as you can tell from the history of the site, the visitors really dominated our attention, thanks to these inscriptions and also the different kind of activities they did, either adding new images or restoring old ones. But all this doesn't mean that there's no monastic managers at Nankan Caves. In fact, from the let me go back to the plan. From these burial caves at the southern end of the site. So we've been looking at the main cliff face. So we just go further south. You actually have what we call burial caves. Basically, after these monks pass away, their bodies will be cremated and the ashes will be interred into some very tiny, I guess, caves or holes on the cliff face, and they'll be decorated with some sort of stupa images. And so that's how we know they might be burial sites for the monks. And we also know from some of the names of temples that there was once a pretty big monastery built probably nearby, maybe somewhere in front of the cliff. It's called Guangfu Monastery, but we don't really have a lot of records left by these monks or any really detailed references to the temple itself. So the site actually gives you a sense of the dynamics or the tension between the two major stakeholder groups. So the monastic managers on the one hand, and the visitors on the other. So let me dive briefly into the differences between these two stakeholder groups. So for the managers, the monks who run this place, they are most concerned about achieving some sort of self-sufficiency in order to carry out the fundamental mission of the site, namely to provide a place for the monastic community to practice and also provide services to the surrounding lay community to satisfy their religious needs. So in order to do that, they couldn't just rely on donations from the lay community because maybe most of the people around were not rich enough to give them what they needed to survive. And so they probably rely on other activities to be self-sufficient. And agricultural productions oftentimes were pretty common at Buddhist temples, not just caves, but Buddhist temples in general. And we have all kinds of records about temple estates and how they make use of the natural resources around them to generate money. And oftentimes they are the largest landholding organization in a certain area. And so people will work for them or cultivate certain parts, and then they will share the harvest with the temples. So temple economics is actually a very important part of Buddhist history of Buddhism. And so the productivity of the land, to be able to be self-sufficient, all these are really top concerns for managers in the pre-modern period. Now, when we turn to the visitors, say in the same time period, we see very different concerns. So they're not, they're not paying much attention. They don't consider productivity of the land or land use in general to be their top priority. Instead, they're looking at something more personal, or communal, or familial. So oftentimes, cave temple sites were places where they see as a source for solace, resilience, and rejuvenation. So they wanted wishes to be fulfilled by dedicating images to deities they worship in order to make these wishes happen. So they're concerned about happiness in the family, good health, prosperity, and one very common motivation for donation was that you pray to the Buddha for good fortune in life or prosperity, and lo and behold, you get a promotion, then they will come back and do more. And so all these are related to the continuity of family relations, social institutions, and religious beliefs. And so as you can see, what they're aiming to sustain or preserve in the long term are precisely part of the existing social order, of which they were part. And so cave temples provide a very important venue in pre-modern China to achieve precisely these goals. And so that, I would say, it's a really important part of how we can learn about sustainability. So that's something that I would like to talk more about. So to give you one example from Nankan Caves, I'd like to turn to this section, niche 77. So you can see, and I try to wrap up as soon as I can. So this niche was first built in the 8th century, judging by the sculptural style. But I'm not focusing on the initial creation. I'm more interested in what happened in the 9th century, about 100 or so years later, when this local official, someone named Li Xihong, dedicated or he sponsored the restoration of about 13 niches around this whole area. And he left behind a very large inscription. And what's really interesting is that he did it not just to focus on himself, but in fact, he bring his son into, he mentioned his sons quite often. And his son's name is Baoso, okay? And in this particular excerpt, you can see what he's trying to achieve. We wish that our son Baoso would grow up smart, effortlessly, and without causing us any trouble. So apparently, his son is not doing too well. He's a troublemaker. And so through the restoration activities, he wants him to behave just to become like himself, a responsible citizen, a generous donor to the religious community, and also carry on a lot of these aspirations. And so this is not just articulated through words, but in fact, you can see that. So if you just turn to the side and look, and you see a male donor figure, so probably Li Xihong himself, and then the son, Baoso. And then also the names are actually carved almost like a caption along the edges of a lot of these niches that have been restored by the Li family at this point. So his wife and daughters also show up. So here you see the wife and the two of the daughters. So he has 5 daughters based on the inscriptions, 5 daughters and 2 sons. But Bao Shou, one of the sons, plays a very important role, at least assigned by the father. So, so as I argued earlier, family relations to carry on the family practices at Nankan Caves become a really important part of the motivation. Now, I have this table to show you the 13 niches restored by Lee over the years of 887 and 888. And so you can see Bao Shou's name mentioned very explicitly 6 times, whereas the wife only showed up twice and the daughters only once. And also really interesting to point out that restoration continue at Nankan at different stages, even though the Lee family, we never heard from them again after this, but there are other donors who somehow carry on. Like, for example, niche 78 is being restored so many times, and it's just based on inscriptions. So maybe there are other rounds of restorations that have not been recorded. So this is a very real possibility. It's just that we have not done very careful technical analysis of these images, see how many layers of paint there might have been in order to retrace them. And so, so you see that I'm just giving you one tiny example from this Lee family in the late 9th century, but it's been carried on so many times by other people. And most of the donors at Nankan Cave are pretty local, and some of them came from far, because it's also, the site's actually known for its scenic beauty, because it's slightly elevated, there's a river nearby, and if there's a platform in front, so you get a very nice view of the surrounding. And I think the setting of this temple in the mountain, it's actually really important. And I think we go back to the inscription by Li Sihong from 887, the same one when you talk about his son. He paid very close attention to the fact that it's part of nature. And so this is a very important reference, that when you look at these images, if you look at them with reverence, your sins will be pardoned, and then you will increase your merits and fortunes. So I think it's not just any Buddha images, say you put in a urban temple or in your home, but I think the fact that it's part of a mountain that make them so efficacious. And I think some of these donors make note of that in the recordings, in the inscriptions. So this is a really important fact to acknowledge. Now, I know I'm running short on time, so let me show you something from the more recent period in the 20th century. And I turn to this period to show you some new commissions. So, so the 2 niches that you see on the screen date respectively from 1937 and 1948. And these donors left behind some inscriptions, especially the one on your left, niche 7. And the way they talk about their motivations and why they want to do it and what kind of wishes they want to be fulfilled through this devotional act sounded like, you know, it's from the Tang Dynasty. So this whole tradition continued pretty much more or less continuously through full time or in different major episodes all the way down to the present day. Now, things didn't really change profoundly until the founding of the People's Republic of China, when this site, Nankan Caves, were designated a cultural heritage property. And it was made into a public park. And so I will return to the overview of the site. So it became part of this massive complex called Nankan Mountain Scenic Area in the 80s. And it's clustered together with some very unusual monuments. So to the To one side, you have the Museum of Sichuan and Shanxi Revolutionary Base. And then if you look to the top of the mountain, there's actually a staircase going up. And then you see there's so many revolutionary heritage. So a lot of these monuments were added in the 1990s and early 2000s because Baoding was a hotbed for Chinese communism in the 20s and especially in the 30s. So it's not the mainstream Chinese communism because the head of the Sichuan group lost to Mao Zedong in a very important battle. And he later left China to work for Chiang Kai-shek or Chiang Kai-shek. So in some ways, not a good turn of events for Sichuan communists. But before all this, there's actually a pretty long history. So it was the second Soviet in China. And also they were fighting enemies of the people, the landlords and other nationalists in the late 30s. And so there's a very complicated history there. And the Red Army was celebrated. So there's a very big monument of the Red Army. I'm going to show you here. So all these monuments can be found at the top of the Nankan mountain. And so this really bizarre cluster of different kinds of heritage at one site can be seen as a result of the local authorities' effort to take advantage of the explosion of domestic tourism in China starting in the early 21st century. So red tourism was heavily promoted by the central government since Baoding has this very illustrious history. So they wanted to take advantage of a lot of these things. And so Nankan Cave had never been a very popular tourist destination. But because of this unusual juxtaposition, physical juxtaposition at the same site, it's being band together to form this scenic area, Nankan Mountain. And it's still very much a evolving type of situation. And I would add that the promotion of red tourism in the early 21st century was part of the central government's attempt to promote sustainability, because some of the most popular tourist destinations in China are all related to its heritage. And they all are so inundated by so many millions of people. Like the Forbidden City is falling apart. And now it's being kept to about 8 million visitors a year, and still is a huge number. And even Mogao Caves of Dunhuang, another really famous cave temple, got over 1 million visitors just in the summer months alone. And so it's really unsustainable to have so many tourists. And so as a way to spread people out to different parts of China and also different kinds of heritage, red tourism was heavily promoted. And so, I just give you a little bit of the background here. So I know I'm running out of time, so I just want to make a few concluding remarks. And so throughout this talk, I'm trying to show you that cave temples are living examples that embody what has been called the long-term preservation of opportunity to live well. And so that's actually another definition common in today's sustainability discourse. So it is for long-term preserving opportunity so that we all can live well together. And so inherent in this kind of discourse are ideas about equity, justice, ethics. So all of these are central to today's sustainability discourse. And of course, you know, if you look a bit outside the familiar territory, to say religion or cultural monuments, we see that you have so many examples from the past that we can draw on. And I'm asking all of you to say, why not? You know, to really look at these sites and learn from what people did in the past to sustain those sites. And so, so that's why I argue in this book that cave temples are part of the world's sustainable future. And I will end my talk here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Lee. Let's just, since you kind of ended by talking about the main argument of your book, could you just tell us very quickly what the 5 major chapters are? or the
Sh
structure of the book?
Sure. As I mentioned a bit earlier, I asked two basic questions: how nature shaped the design of the site, and how the site changed the way people interact and think about nature. So I have two chapters on the first question, and then three chapters on the second question. So, and the last three chapters are pretty much about sustainability from the three major stakeholder groups. So that's roughly the general organization of the book. And then I have a postscript to talk about some of the newer cave temple sites being built in this region in the last 20, 30 years.
So we already have a couple of questions, and we'll start with the most direct one. So why did you choose to focus on Sichuan and Sichuanese cave temples for this particular project? And I'll add to it, could you have written a similar book about Dunhuang Mogao caves or about Longmen caves? Why Sichuan?
Okay, it's a really good question. Because if I may go back to my map, let's see. Okay. So Sichuan is actually a very unique geographic region. So besides the four rivers I talked about, we also need to talk about the mountains. So it's semi-isolated from the rest. So it has its own ecosystem, so to speak. And the history of Sichuan is also unique due to this kind of isolation. And for people who know something about Chinese history will know that whenever there are problems in central China, the emperors will try to escape into Sichuan. So that's a very convenient way for me to choose a well-defined area where it has this unique history and ecosystem. And I certainly welcome other scholars to write other history, to write about the other sites, say Norman caves, like about Funan, the Middle Yellow River region, or Yungan caves. Certainly, it's very doable with Gansu, with Bukdonghuang, because it's a fairly well-defined historical and geological and climatic region. So I think the three has to be aligned in some way in order to make it doable and coherent. So I think that's a short answer to this question.
Great. Thank you. So there are several questions about the site of Nankan. First, can you tell us about the geology of Nankan, and also is there a degradation of the site from pollution? Are there efforts to preserve this site from pollution or from other sorts of harmful effects? Or is the site's integrity in danger or not?
Well, in Bazhong, there are actually several cave temple sites. Nankan Cave being the largest and the most centrally located. So it's near the city center, so inevitably there's some pollution going from the city. But Bazhong is not heavily industrial compared to other places. So, so it's not as affected by acid rain as other sites. And also, thanks to this once existed shelter in front, it's actually been relatively well preserved up to today. So, so the integrity of the site is not in doubt. And northern Sichuan is relatively clean compared to other part of Sichuan. So you go to Chongqing, it's a different story. And you can see my map, Daba Mountain is supposed to be very pristine compared to the other mountains. And those are pretty tall because it's really literally separated Sichuan from Central Plain here. And so in terms of what people have done to preserve the site, so you might remember from some of these pictures, there seems to be some darker area. I think they apply some sort of consolidant to the rock, so it's a bit darker, so it's not like ink or pollution. I think it's just the color of the consolidant or the chemical, they spray it. So, and you can also see that concrete has been applied at the bottom to solidify the base. And I would also add that in 2009, the central government, the State Administration of Cultural Heritage, the central government primary agency in charge of everything cultural heritage, carry out a restoration project at the site. And so, so they did all this. I think the main purpose actually to enhance the attractiveness of the site and also improve signage to make the site more accessible so that it will attract more tourists. They didn't say that part, but I think you can kind of tell from the things that they did. That's maybe the implicit goal. But I think another thing that they also been thinking a lot about is to nominate a site to be some sort of UNESCO World Heritage Site. But of course, it's not quite enough. Nowadays, the strategy done not only by China, but a lot of countries is to do a cluster nomination. So if one site is not significant enough to satisfy all 6 categories, so you throw in a couple others so that, you know, at least you make up for the insufficiency elsewhere. And so I think if you just go with the cave temple route, so there are actually several very successful nominations before, is to lump Nankan Cave with Guangyuan, you know, the other major city with major cave temple sites in northern Sichuan, but they didn't do that. So instead, you know, they're going with this very bizarre combination of revolutionary heritage with, you know, Buddhist caves. So I don't know how far they can go with that. And I don't think it's not even close to be nominated internally because there's so much competition in China these days for these nominations.
That's fascinating. What kind of rock is it at Nankan?
It's some sort of red sandstone, and it's very common throughout the entire Sichuan region. So, so it's fairly easy to carve, and also it's very susceptible to erosion. And so that's why the shelter did a huge job of preserving it. And so that's why it's reasonable for the site managers now to think about rebuilding something in front.
Great. So could you say something about the present-day Guangfu temple that's at the northern part of this Nanshan scenic area? Is it a recent reconstruction of the original temple, or is it older? How does it fit into the overall layout?
It's a brand new temple using an old name. I didn't include a picture of it, but it's very new. They have a pond in front of it too. So it's all today's imagination. Philip knows, if you go travel to China today, there's so many old towns, but they're all new. It's this craze about heritage and also about domestic tourism that you see. And so this site in some ways caught in this craze. So I don't know, it might go out it at some point, or maybe move into a certain direction. We don't know. But being a tourist destination, it's both a blessing and a curse.
So how does something like this temple that is a recent, not reconstruction, but a recent construction built as part of a kind of tourist effort, how does that fit into your thoughts about the sustainability of this particular site?
Yes, so Nankan Cave, just the part with the old Buddhist images, only receive about 70,000 people a year. So it's a very small number. So a comparable example is Mogao Caves, over 1 million in 3 months a year. So I mean, it doesn't even compare. And so, so in order to attract more people, they need to do something, right? And if we turn to the museum, I asked the director that she said that there's over 1 million visitors a year. So people doing red tourism. And I had some statistics in my book. So I think 2010, there's close to 1,800,000 visitors to Badong, and over a third of them wanted to do red tourism. They came to Baoding for this purpose. Now they projected that by 2020, it will be 10 million visitors. So of course, this is wishful thinking, but maybe a couple million. It's very possible because we're talking about China, and then if we just apply the same rate, maybe over a third or even maybe more than that, you're talking about millions of people, right? So I think that's definitely that could be at the museum. There's a million visitors a year, so they would go do red tourism. They would stop at the museum first, and then drive up and park the bus, and then they would do all this. So there's a lot of things to see at the top. Some of them pretty kitschy, you can see from my slides. But there's some of them very serious. There's a cemetery for members of the Red Army, and then the eulogies or inscriptions in their honor, and then and other things. So they want to take advantage of this trend. But at the same time, they also want to highlight its uniqueness as a Buddhist faith, because that's been a very successful part of China's participation in the UNESCO enterprise. And so for the central government, they want to go that route. But of course, for the locals, they see that, that's not going to work for them because they probably don't like the people in Guangdong. That's why they don't want to partner with them. And so they want to make it just Badong, right? It's Ba culture. And so there's a lot of tension between what people want to do at different levels of the government. And so and the site has a relatively low status, not like a nationally ranked important cultural heritage property, not at that level. Maybe this is part. So yeah, so there's all kinds of unevenness in what can be done for the site. But at least the government cares about preserving as much of the old niches as possible, and so they try to maintain proper preservation of the site. But of course, the local officials might push for certain things. So we don't know. This is a constant tug of war going on between these different levels.
Thank you. So there are two questions kind of about people's treatment of the site in the past, where in general, were visitors to the site or potentially worshippers to the site respectful of the caves and the images? How did they interact with the surrounding landscape of the caves? Mm-hmm. And also, did the site experience periods of iconoclasm or destruction during its history?
Sure. Yes. One part of the chapter on Nankan caves actually deal with some very specific natural features. So in this plan, you have this rock. I didn't bring a specific photograph, but it's separated from the rest. So my guess is that there was some earthquake many centuries ago, and then this rock just fell off or just stood by itself. And so it has a very special meaning at the site. It gives an illusion that it's actually an island. And so there's a lot of really beautiful Avalokiteshvara images carved on it. And you can also tell from my images from the 20th century, this deity continued to be really popular. So there's a lot of new Avalokiteshvara images at the site added. And so just the location of this rock and this illusion that it conjures, I think it sort of tells you how the people at Nankan or the visitors to Nankan interacted with nature. So that's one feature I talk about. Another is back in the Song Dynasty, there's supposed to be a giant cedar tree near the one edge of the site. So a lot of poets who went to the site wrote poems about it. And then sometime in the 12th century, the tree just fell down and died. Not quite dead, but because there's this tiny tree that grew up from that spot. And so people wrote about it, and a lot of these poems ended up inscribed in one cave. I say a cave because you can actually walk inside there. So it's a collection of pretty much poetic writings about a site for a very long time. And if you read through some of them, you realize that they all celebrate really unusual natural features at a site. So the trees and all that, the rocks are separated. And so I dealt with them. And you can see nature is being bred as a metaphor of some basic conditions in life. That's what poets usually do, to make an illusion of something else without telling you the underlying motives. And so I can add to that. Let's see. Can you remind me about
what about like destruction or iconoclasm?
Yes, yeah. So you can see in my chart. So at the end of the Ming Dynasty, the site was badly damaged. So there's actually several inscriptions that describe the destruction of the site. So I think probably referring to the shelter in front. So it's very easy to destroy just by burning it. And then being rebuilt, and then it was destroyed again in the late 18th century. So it was destroyed, and I assume sometime in the Yuan period, it was also badly damaged and abandoned. And so, vegetation grew here and there. And so, yeah, so definitely it's been destroyed or badly damaged, but then people went back and rebuilt, and they repainted a lot of the caves and then left behind inscriptions. So that's why you have this very rich history of different cycles of reuse and revival.
What about in the 20th century? Did the site how did it fare during the Cultural Revolution or during the periods of civil war earlier in the 20th century?
Yes, so I had this question in mind when I visited Nankan caves because it's such a hotbed for Red Army, right? So you expect the Red Guard's going to show up and destroy the whole place. Actually, it did not happen. And I asked the site manager why, and my colleague told me an urban legend. Basically, she said that during the Cultural Revolution, so of course the Red Guards came, and some came with guns. And so one young Red Guard fired a gun, I don't know what kind of gun it was, at the big Buddha. But the bullet bounced back and killed him. And so that really scared everybody off. And so if you look at the site, some parts have been damaged, especially there's a large inscription, and I think someone scraped off each character. Yes, so mischievously. But then most of the other images, they, unharmed. And I also look at the big Buddha. If you look at his face, I don't have a close up, but there's a patch on his face. I don't know if that urban legend is true. Maybe the bullets hit his face, and of course the Buddha is not happy, and then just let the bullet bounce back and kill the Red Guard. And so I think that's sort of an example of not to destroy cultural heritage.
We have, I think, 3 final questions. One should be pretty quick. So does anyone mention Doofu in the inscriptions? He wrote, a poem on an old cypress as a symbol of endurability. So does he ever come up in the inscriptions at Nankan? That you remember?
No, not in Northern Sichuan. He was in Chengdu. No, his name was not mentioned, but there are other Tang poets mentioned. There was a pretty well-known official named Yan Wu. So he came with the Tang Emperor down here and stayed here in the 8th century. So after the Baodingshan rebellion, and he commissioned several images here. So and then there are a couple others Song poets as well. A particular well-known is Zhongze. He's a well-known poet general. So he was stationed somewhere in northern China. He was ready to go to war with the Liao, but then he got sent to be a official here. So he was very frustrated. So he wrote about this victory. And so it became a poetic vehicle for him to vent about a political situation that, it's such a beautiful tree, but it's not being used properly by people. So I think that's really obvious what he's talking about. So there are other poets being mentioned here.
This is probably quite a complicated question, but could you kind of outline the research process for the book? How did you go about tackling such a huge topic?
You mean for this particular case or the book in general?
The question says the book, but
the book.
Well,
I think, I spent a lot of time at these sites. As you can see, a lot of them outdoor. And I started to visit Sichuan when I was a grad student many years ago. And I kind of enjoyed it, even though it's very physically demanding, usually it rains crazy all of a sudden and you just have to find shelters and you have to walk a lot. Sometimes these sites in the middle of a rice paddy. And so I'm becoming more sensitive to the ecological conditions. So the rain, humidity, and some of my colleagues in Sichuan love to joke about these, and they love to tell you, Sichuan food is hot and you need to have a lot of red pepper and peppercorns to deal with humidity. And so humidity is a big factor in a lot of these. So I deal with this topic more in the restorers chapter when I interview a lot of restorers and talk about eco-compatibility of material and technique, because something work in Los Angeles doesn't mean it's going to work in Sichuan, even though it's the best adhesive or whatever technique you have in conservation. So you just have to adapt to the local ecological conditions, the climatic conditions. And so I started this project 10 years ago, and I started with the Leshan Buddha because it has such a rich history of technology and of course, the rivers. But I thought I didn't have enough material to do it as a book. And I thought, I realized that I'm missing something, because if you really want to have a firm grasp of the impact of the environment on material objects, you need something more technical to be able to measure them. And so I got a lot of training in heritage conservation. So not just the technical side, but also the management side. And so I took courses, I went to professional workshops to educate myself. And of course, I also are familiar with the more traditional type of primary sources material. Inscriptions are an important part, but they don't tell you the full story. And so I try to put all of them together, and then I also learn a lot about all this more theoretical, philosophical discussions about climate change, about the Anthropocene, about sustainability. And so how do I fit all of them together? It's because I think caves allows you to encompass all of them. So it's just a matter of organizing all these different aspects into a coherent story. And I hope I did okay with that. And I look forward to hear comments from my readers. And so this is certainly a beginning of this type of scholarship, and I hope to do more. And I hope that other scholars would do more, because one person is not enough to tackle a subject like this.
Just one final question. I wish we could have ended on that beautiful note, but I think there's one more question that we should ask. So thank you, Sonya, for this fascinating perspective on the cave temples and their meaning and importance for us now. We may have tended to focus on past history and possible interpretations, which are always fraught. So do you feel it's more important both for us and for the preservation of the sites to focus on sustainability and their meaning to contemporary culture?
Well, I would say that because of the subject of my study, these sites are special, both in the past, present, and I hope certainly will be in the future. I think it's very important to keep this three temporal different parts together in some way. And if we just stick with how people talk about sustainability today, just focusing on what we do now so that we will have less impact on the future, or try not to compromise what people do in the future, that's fine. But I think, we're also missing something. Human society has been around for a very long time. And of course, we have not preserved as much from the past as we have more in recent times, but still there's a lot of things we can learn. And I think it's important to make the past be part of our discussion today, and not to forget what people did in the past. And some might think that what we face is unique, unprecedented, like only now that happened. But I think if you look back in the Earth history and human history, something similar happened before, and it will be very beneficial to learn how people dealt with those problems in the past. So I would like to keep all three. And in some way, this book breaks that mold of historical analysis, historical study, by focusing on one moment in time and dig very deep and try to learn everything about that moment. Here I'm jumping, both past, present, future in different ways. As long as the evidence at hand allows me to do. Sometimes I talk about a prehistory of a site. So, and I find it challenging and also fun to do this kind of work.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing your work with us this evening. That was fantastic.
Thank you.
Thanks. So we have a couple of events coming up in person at the Huntington. There will be a calligraphy demonstration by Tang Qingyan on Saturday, April 9th in the Chinese Garden. And we're doing a conversation with composer Nathan Wong and author Lisa C. on April, I think, 21st. Our lecture series will return in the fall, and I hope everyone will check the Huntington Center for East Asian Garden Studies webpage for details about it. So please join me in thanking Professor Sonya Lee once again for her wonderful talk this evening, and I hope to see everyone soon. So thank you, Professor Lee.
Thank you.